Hi everyone, this is Hanney Seylim. Welcome to the Critical Faculty Show. Today, I've got I've got a couple of things running at the same time here. Today, I've got Dan Barker one more time. Last conversation we had, we said we were always going to be discussing free will. It's a topic that I'm personally very interested in. And good morning to you, Dan.
Good morning to you. Good to talk to you again, Hen.
Fantastic. Well, I've been reading your book for the second time in preparation.
Really?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think you had no choice. You had no free will to decide that.
That's exactly what Christopher Hitchens said. He said, "Do you think we've got free will?" He said, "Yes, we have no choice."
That's funny.
Yeah. Well, it's such an interesting topic because it's one that's divided philosophers, scientists, people on the street. It is quite trippy, to be honest. So let's start from the very beginning. Let's just dissect it. Do you think the free will saga or the free will conversation has emerged because we have developed the illusion of consciousness? Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about that if we were not aware that we could possibly have free will.
Well, that's the title. The title of my book is Free Will Explained: How Science and Philosophy Converge to Create a Beautiful Illusion. So you are right that nobody seems to agree.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophers don't agree with each other, although most philosophers tend to lean towards what we call compatibilism. They would embrace free will in some way or another. Scientists don't agree with each other either, although most scientists tend to lean more towards determinism. There's no free will at all. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of people that think both sides can be put together. They're called compatibilists, that say, well, yeah, science is right, but philosophy is right too. And I used to be a compatibilist. I used to think that, scientific determinists were just defining free will too narrowly. But now I have a totally different take. I don't think there's a linear, horizontal, dilemma between these two sides. I don't think there's two sides. I think it's not this. I think it's this. So I think the scientists are right. If you're looking horizontally at cause and effect through time, none of us chose to be born. You didn't pick your brain cells. You didn't pick your strengths and talents and proclivities. You didn't choose who you are, although you have this feeling that you are free, right? We all have that feeling. It's strange. But the scientists are right. All of our brain cells even were predetermined by natural cause and effect. So we can't take credit for that. When your parents had sex and you were born, there was a random recombination of DNA and the molecules. And so here we are. We end up like an elephant or a chipmunk or a bird, any other creature that evolved on this planet through the natural processes. And yet, we do feel like life is not just this. We feel like life is this way. We feel like there's something that jumps outside of natural law. And the word free will, depending how you define it, is a way that a lot of us try to talk about that. A lot of believers think that there's something that actually jumps outside of nature. It's like supernatural. It's like a soul or a spirit or something, like gods and things. And so they do think that we are morally responsible because we are making a decision about, nature. So we can get into some of the details of it later, but before you even decide if you think we have free will or we don't, before you even make that decision, if you say yes or if you say no, first you have to define what is it that you are saying yes or no to. What is free will? So what would you think it is, Hanney?
Well, I mean, and that's exactly. Thank you for asking me this question, because I thought most of the debates around that area was a lot of semantics going on. There's a lot of playing around with words, and words mean different things to different people. So I think by defining, and I did love the apple analogy that you put onto some other debater the other day, where you have two apples on a table. Somebody else bring two apples. How many apples are there? And the answer was 4, which is wrong. The apples is all the apples out there. So once you define what you're really talking about, you're really get down to it. And to me, the free will, and it's very, very simple. I mean, Sam Harris puts it as that nice illusion where you seem to be going to the ice cream parlor and have got chocolate or vanilla, and you choose for some reason vanilla over chocolate, and you prefer vanilla, but you don't really think about why do you prefer vanilla. Why have you preferred vanilla over the years over chocolate and all these things? So there must be something out there, but it's practical. It serves the purpose that I'm getting what I think that I want. So to me, I'm complete agreement with you. It sounds like it's a social construct. It's a contract that we as social species have developed together to be able to hold each other responsible to a certain contract that will benefit the whole of the race or the species, if you wish.
Yeah, and maybe contract is the right word. Maybe it's not. We are socially evolved tribal animals, and it's not that we've made some conscious contract with each other. I'll agree to think this, if you will. It's just that we can't help it because we are, at the horizontal level of science, we are just evolved creatures. But when you stack a whole bunch of things together, you combine them together, you can create an emergent property. And I agree with Sam Harris that free will is an illusion. The difference I have with him, though, is that I think it's a beautiful, useful illusion. He thinks it's a pernicious illusion. So if you look at the group of us, not just one individual, like one animal, if you look at the social group that we are, and we evolve socially, you have properties that emerge that don't exist in science, actually. So as you were hinting there, free will is not a scientific truth. There is no free will. Determinism is inviolate. We are all determined. But that doesn't mean we can't say that free will is not a social truth. There's a lot of social truths that are not scientific. So just for a simple analogy I use in the book is sand. If you have a grain of sand, it's hard. You could scratch something with a grain of sand. I could scratch my computer screen here with a grain of sand, right? But if you have a collection of sand, like at the beach, sand is not hard, sand is soft, right? So let me ask you the question, is sand hard or is sand soft? And you would reply, well, it depends if you're talking about one particle or if you're talking about the whole thing. So if sand is soft, talking about the group rather than the individual, where is the softness? What is the softness? It doesn't exist in any one of the grains. It's not a thing. It doesn't, you can't point to the softness. It's a property that emerges when you get a huge collection of things. Same thing with water molecules and wetness. Where's the wetness in the water? There is no wetness in an H2O molecule. So I think similarly, it's a rough analogy, and you can't always argue by analogy. I think we can all say that as individual animals, we don't have free will. We are the individual molecule, but in the group, free will, as you say, is a social emergent truth, I guess. There's scientific truth and social truth that emerges in the group, and it emerges because, as you say, we need to make, at least as social animals, we need to survive. We need to make behavioral judgments. We need to make moral judgments about the actions of other human beings. Do I lock that person up in jail? Do I put them in a mental institution? Do I stay away from them? Do I praise them? Do I denounce them? You know what I mean? We make all these judgments as a social group that it affects how we survive. So I think we can say, like, not just like with sand that's soft and hard, but think about things like race. Science will tell you on the scientific horizontal that there's no such thing as race. It doesn't exist. You can't divide a line between one group of people. All over the planet, any individual can mate with any other individual. in Africa or in Egypt or in Australia or whatever, no matter what we think we are one human species. So science is correct. There is no such thing as race. And yet, tell that to a person who's a racial minority in a white privileged society. Tell them there's no such thing as race, and they're going to say, you're crazy. I live with race all the time. Race is a social understanding. It's a construct. It's an invention. It's a way for the superior people, especially in the United States, way for the superior white people to feel like they are above, and then the people down below are a different category. So race is extremely important socially. It's a social truth, but it's not a scientific truth. Think about marriage. Marriage is not a thing. When two I do weddings sometimes, and I say I now pronounce you a married couple. Nothing changes in the universe when people get married. What changes is not scientifically. What changes is a social understanding. Now society views that couple as married, right? Even though it's not a thing. And there's hundreds of examples you could give of truths that we live with in our social lives that are not really scientific truths. And so we can live with race because we have to deal with it all the time, even though we can admit to the scientists, you're right, there's no such thing as race, but let's talk about race. So there's no such thing as free will. There really isn't. But let's talk about it because we live with it in our daily social lives.
Yeah, so I guess it's akin to the consciousness situation. People were trying to look for consciousness everywhere, in the brain, in the soul, in the heart. But it seems it's going to be a very similar situation. Once you have a lot of complex processes and operations going at the same time, you'll have that emerging property that will emerge, be it the illusion of consciousness or the illusion of free will. But it's not a thing. It doesn't exist somewhere, and it's not a defined by in one area. It's an emerging property that seems to appear under certain conditions. But once you isolate these conditions, like the grain of sand, that property might be not the dominant property of that particular observational item. With races, though, this was I always often thought about that, because obviously with race you have always that negative connotation. When you think of race, you think of racism, which is something that is horrible, we want to get rid of. However, there is something that we can define, we can observe with races. There is a distinguished look between Africans and Europeans, and that could serve sometime as an interesting identification of a person. So you might say somebody of a Caucasian appearance, in terms of criminology, or trying to identify somebody. Or you're talking casually at work, you say, oh, that tall dude, the German with the blue eyes and blonde hair. You don't mean anything by it, but because it's an observable fact, you refer to it in a non-malicious way. Do you? I mean, I know this is not deviates away from free will. Do you think that's acceptable? That is all right?
Well, no two human beings are identical. You and I are not identical. No two supposedly white people. And by the way, whiteness is a historically pretty new concept. The whole idea of whiteness originated when Europeans came to the United States. I've heard some Africans tell me in Africa, there are no black people. In fact, I think Isabel Wilkerson uses that in her book, Caste. And you say, what do you mean there's no black people? It's a whole continent full of black people. But in Africa, the people don't think of themselves as, oh, I'm black. They think of themselves, I'm from this tribe, or I'm from this area. I'm a human being. And it's only when they come over to America, then they realize, oh, I'm black. Oh, I didn't, it's a social construct that's imposed by those who want to have power over others. So you, by your color, you are put in this caste level or this thing. So it doesn't exist, but it does exist. And with free will, I think we can say the same thing. It doesn't exist, but it does exist. It's one of these things that emerges from our social, and you're right, it's free will. Some people think free will is pernicious, like you think racism is pernicious. People like Sam Harris and Jerry Coyne, and I talk about them in my book. We're friends, by the way, but we can disagree. They think that the whole idea of free will is really a bad thing that we should discard. We shouldn't even use the phrase, because that allows, like in a court of law, that allows for moral judgment that leads to like capital punishment, leads to extreme forms of putting people down. Oh, you made a horrible decision, a sinful decision, or a decision meriting the death penalty, and they think that free will is the culprit. They think because we think we have free will, then we are putting people into moral categories, and that justifies us treating people in bad ways. And I think free will is not the problem. I think these concepts, a lot of them are religious concepts of retributive justice, for example. I think these concepts are the problem, not so much free will is the problem.
Yeah, it's very complex. I'm with Dennett. I've been following the Dennett Sam Harris conversation, and I believe you lean towards the Dennett sort of proposition that it's an illusion, but it's a handy one. It's a good one to have. It's helped us survive our evolution. It's practical. We can use it on daily basis, just like consciousness, which is, again, it's a beautiful illusion that to help the brain computate a lot of complex processes that would have not been able to unless you have that sort of illusion. So it's a good one. However, with Sam Harris, I mean, the idea of punishment and how can you punish or trying to rehabilitate or change somebody who probably wouldn't be able to because of deterministic propositions. With this sort of analogy at hand, whether it's a good or an evil illusion, can we really put somebody to responsibility and put them on trial or try to rehabilitate him, knowing that they are probably not going to change, or the possibility of change is going to be based on some random selections out there?
Yeah, well, I think there are different questions. Obviously, there are some criminals who can be rehabilitated. They go into the system and they can change, right? We would hope that they would take some personal responsibility. There are others who cannot. Although about 4% of the population of our species is what you would call sociopathic or psychopathic, which is pretty scary. 4% is a pretty big number. Mm-hmm. In the prison system, they're way overrepresented. I think it's like 20% of the prison population are psychopaths. There's no hope to rehabilitate them. There's something wrong with their brains physically. Is it their fault? It's not their fault. They were born that way. So it depends on what you think of as punishment. If you think punishment, like in the religious frame of mind, punishment is, you're bad, you're a sinner, you need to be punished, you need to wallow in your guilt, you need to feel shame, society wants you to just wallow and apologize to us. You know what I mean? If that's how you view punishment, and you're going to hurt because of this, there are some people that's never going to work for. There's some people who, as you say, we shouldn't even apply that to, because that's not their fault. Maybe they have a brain tumor. Maybe there's something, and Sam Harris brings this out very well in his writing, and Jerry Coyne as well. But I think, and maybe you were hinting at this, that we don't have to take that paradigm, that sort of religious moralistic kind of approach toward judging other human beings. I think if we flip it and think about what's the best to protect ourselves, maybe I don't even care about that criminal. Maybe we shouldn't care about that criminal, but what we should care about is society. So what's the best thing for society? If that person is going to be committing these horrible, harmful crimes, then it's best for us to protect ourselves from that person by locking them up, whether they feel bad or not, whether they feel guilty or not, whether they confess to us in tears that they did something wrong or not. Hitler never did that. Hitler died, and he's not in some hell somewhere going, oh, I was such a bad person. He's just dead. And society never got that out of him. And should society expect that out of people? What society wants is to stop people like that. We want to protect ourselves from people like that. So it could be prison, or it could be a mental hospital. It could be some way of lessening the threat and the harm to us as a social species. And that's why free will is so important. That's why we're judging people. We assume that that person, the definition of free will that most people take is that you had the ability to do otherwise. You did one action, but you actually could have chosen chocolate. You really could have. The determinists say, no, you couldn't have. And so moral judges and juries and such are looking at a accused defendant saying, you did this, but you could have done that instead. So that you were responsible by free will. You were responsible for your own actions. Well, whether you have free will or not, the person is still the locus of the action. That person is still responsible. They did it, even if it goes back to some genetic deformity from the great-great-grandparents. They still are the ones who did it. And that is the person we need to protect ourselves from. So we make a moral judgment to take care of the risk to society.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. So basically, our idea of punishment and retribution are changing. Even though there isn't a free will to speak of, what we're doing really is isolating that vessel that contains the deterministic tendencies, so they can no longer hurt society. So you just isolate them. And while you're isolating them, if there's a chance of rehabilitating them and bringing them back to the fold, and they can contribute again to the society, so that's a great thing. But if not, then you're isolating the vessel that holds the deterministic tendencies that can harm the society even further. And that's what you're doing. You're not really feeling good about punishing them like back in the old days where people casting stones and they're feeling good about it. It's no longer that. It's just really, it's protecting society.
I give a story in the book. If you read that far, in eastern Tennessee, there was a circus, and an elephant in the circus the elephant's name was Mary, was taking the lead in this small town in Tennessee. And the circus was shorthanded. So the day before, they hired this guy. This guy was a homeless itinerant guy who didn't know anything, but they needed somebody to ride. And they took one day and they trained him, and they said, here's this stick with a sharp end on it, and you can control the elephant by poking it with a stick. That's how you control an elephant. So this guy got up on the elephant and is leading the parade. And the elephant saw a watermelon rind on the ground. And so the elephant reached down and stopped to eat the watermelon rind. That's what a natural animal would do, right? And this untrained rider was saying, move on, move it. So he took the stick and he jabbed it into the side jaw of this elephant, jabbed it to get it to move. And the elephant, he didn't know that. They knew later that the elephant had this abscessed tooth that was in a lot of pain. And so that guy stabbed right into the tooth. And what did the elephant do? The elephant used its trunk and picked up the guy and threw him on the ground and stomped on him. And it killed the guy. So the city was outraged. The elephant is a murderer, they said. So they hanged the elephant. They had a public hanging of an elephant. The first time they hanged it, it broke because it wasn't strong enough. So they got this railroad car with a big derrick on it, and then they got a chain, and all these people showed up. And in fact, that part of Tennessee, they had a lot of public lynchings before, and there were children there, and there was the whole society there to hang this elephant for committing this crime of murder. So I think you would agree with me that elephant wasn't morally guilty of a human crime, right? But society imposed moral judgment. Society assumed free will in that animal. Society assumed that was a bad elephant. And by the way, that public hanging was certainly going to deter other elephants from doing the same thing, I'm sure. But in any event, you can see what happens. Society has this need to punish and to protect ourselves. What good did it do to kill the elephant? No good at all, really. It was a loss to that circus owner too. And whose fault was it that accident happened, actually? But it did some kind of a social good to that community to have that public spectacle of, now we killed that murderer. So that kind of shows you that we have this tendency to project things where they don't belong. We have a tendency to project onto criminals or other humans or other animals even. And there have been other animals killed in history. In the Middle Ages, they would sometimes kill pigs. In fact, one pig one pig was accused of eating a communion wafer, from the church. And so the pig was put to death for the crime of desecrating a communion wafer. So I think that illustration shows that we have this tendency in our brains to blow up the whole thing and to assign free will. And if we did that to the elephant, I think we're doing it to ourselves too.
Yeah.
We're doing the same thing we did to that elephant. We're doing it to other human beings.
I was just thinking of the damage of the children watching the poor elephant being hanged, and how is this going to sort of translate into their probably miserable future. But before we get into the lovely chipmunk story that I'd like my audience to hear from you, just before I started the broadcast, there was a buzzing fly. This is just what happened before the broadcast, Dan. A buzzing fly within the room because I've got the lights, and I was trying to get rid of it. It's noisy, and I wanted to get rid of it. And I don't like killing things, so I was trying to lure it outside using dimming the light in the room and use the light outside. It wasn't happening. It was still there, so I was trying to sort of wave it away, and it got stuck into a spider web and sort of froze there, and it was struggling for its life. And now I knew the topic we were going to be talking about today, and I stood in front of the fly, and I wanted to think and reflect, and I wanted to make a conscious decision. So I looked at the fly and struggling for its life, and I thought that's very convenient, because that fly will eventually be sort of paralyzed and problem solved. I don't have to worry about it anymore. But then the thing was sort of moving, trying to save its life, and I felt bad, and but then the image of a baby spider or a spider wanting to feed on it, and probably it's a chain, it's a food chain out there. That if you save one life, you probably kill another, even if you don't want to. It's crazy, but I've made the decision to free. I couldn't see a spider coming on its way. It was just stuck on the web, and I made a conscious decision. And I said to myself, I'm going to think about it, and I want to make a conscious decision. I want to think and reflect. And I've freed the fly from the spider web using a cloth, and it flew away. For some strange reason, this fly is still in the room, but it stopped buzzing, and it's sitting in a corner. I can see it from the corner of my eye. And it's actually no longer making any sounds, and it's sitting there nice and quiet, as if it's probably saying thank you for freeing it. But did I have a free will in there? I mean, I reflected, I took my time, but did I only act because I'm that way? I'm dispositioned to be kind. I don't know. What do you reckon? And probably with your chipmunk story might be some similarities in there.
Well, yeah, because there's also the question, does the fly have free will? The fly's making decisions, right? And a lot of people confuse free will with choice. A lot of people say, well, I made a choice, so I'm free, right? You can make choices without free will. We all the time. And so before we get to the chipmunk, if a mosquito lands on my arm, I probably just go like this, right? Just to swat it without thinking. And so that's a behavior. I made some kind of a choice. Maybe it was automatic, or maybe I just made this big choice. Swatted a mosquito, right? So yeah, some life ended. And maybe with mosquitoes, that's not a big moral choice, because what good are mosquitoes? Mosquitoes don't help our world at all. In fact, I think the world would be just fine without mosquitoes. Birds can eat something else. However, if I swat a mosquito, that's kind of like a behavioral decision that's more like horizontal. That's kind of what we do in our lives without much reflection, like you were talking about, thinking about it. Oh, should I take the life of what about all the baby mosquitoes that want, all that. But if I were to swat my neighbor, the same action, go over to my neighbor and swat them, why is that any different? Suddenly, instead of a linear 3 + 4 = 7, suddenly when you have a social element involved, it's now 3 squared + 4 squared = 5 squared. You've lifted it to another level. You've lifted it to a different thing. Now swatting my neighbor involves all sorts of other things, legal things and social expectations and shame and retribution and moral judgment and all. Suddenly all these other things come into play when you're talking about the social structure of humans to humans. So I tell the story in the book about the chipmunk in the backyard back in 2014 that I called Little One. And we became friends, and you can actually go online and see a video of it. I'm reading a book in the hammock, and my little friend, it took a while, but eventually he just crawls up my leg and he sits on my lap and he jumps on my chest, and he's not afraid like the other ones. There's one little chipmunk that I had tamed pretty much, not really totally tamed, but it's a wild animal, but you know what I mean. It happens all the time. You can do that with wild animals that get used to you. So while I was in that process of getting acquainted with this little chipmunk, I could see that it was like making decisions. It was afraid and it ran away, but then it wanted to come close to the nut, but then it would back off, and then it would run around, and then pretty soon it would get close, and eventually it would get close enough to jump on my hand. And it looked like, in my mind, I don't know what was happening in the chipmunk's mind. We're both mammals, by the way. You know, we're almost, body shapes are almost identical, except it only has 4 fingers on the front, which is kind of weird. But it looked to me like it was making decisions. It looked like it was weighing its options. Should I run to the nut or should I fly away? And that's understandable, because how did these little animals survive? They had to be aware of other predators, and they had to be afraid of big things like me, you know. So that's natural. That chipmunk didn't choose to be a chipmunk. It didn't pick its, you know, its DNA. It just was born. There it is. And so it has all these inherited instincts that it's trying to work with. But to my brain, and maybe I'm projecting, and maybe we're all projecting when it comes to how we treat other human beings. In my brain, it looked like that little creature had free will. It looked like it. Like it could have made this choice but it didn't. Because other chipmunks made other choices in the backyard. None of them got as friendly as that one. And so that raised the question in my mind, well, okay, so that chipmunk and I, we're related. We have a common ancestor through evolution. So if I'm willing to say that chipmunk doesn't have free will, but it looks like it does, couldn't we say the same thing about human beings? We're much more complex, of course. Our brains are bigger, and we have a broader database of social, you know, we're not the same creatures, obviously, but you can still ask the same question. And that's how this whole book started.
Yeah. It seems to be like we're surrounded by a handful of handy illusions, you know, starting from the illusion of design, you know, the one that Charles Darwin sort of figured out, illusion of free will, illusion of consciousness, depth perception, our senses sort of often deceive us. Do we? I mean, and I think I've watched your debates recently you had with a Christian. This is the page, yeah.
You see the little chipmunk coming up to my hand?
This is fantastic. I watched the footage. Beautiful.
Yeah.
All these handy illusions, but in a recent debate you had Justin Briley, unbelievable. I think you had a Christian radio show host debating you on free will, and he actually tried a clever angle that I actually had to scratch my head a couple of times about, you know, with epistemology, because epistemology is predicated on justified true belief, and you can have a belief, which is we all do, has to be true, but it's got to be also justified. And under the deterministic illusion of free will, you can never claim any knowledge to be justified. Do we need to redefine terms at this point to suit new findings, or there is something that we're missing here?
Yeah, so first to your first question, and then I'll get to the justified belief thing. You are right that we live our life with a lot of illusions, as you point out. Depth perception is an illusion, but we embrace it. We love it. We need it. It helps us. The illusion of depth perception really gives us a positive advantage in navigating the world. And so the illusion of free will, I think, is similar. It's not really true, but it helps us navigate the moral landscape, let's say. It's not really a thing. So I have a problem, and I understand what people are saying when they define knowledge as justified belief. I understand that, and a lot of philosophers and a lot of people, that's their definition of knowledge. But I think that's a misuse of the word belief. You can have unjustified beliefs, like conspiracy theories or religious beliefs or whatever, paranormal stuff. And then they say you can have then justified beliefs, because how are they justified? By evidence, by reason, by observation, by experiment, by whatever. And we all know that in science, there is no fact that we would say is 100% probable. There's none. But when scientists get up to 98, 99%, what they do is round it off, right? You can't prove that there's no unicorns. You can't prove it. But I think your confidence level that there are no unicorns is so high. It's probably 99.9%, whatever. It's never completely 100 or completely zero. Never. Even miracles might have happened, but the probability of miracles is so low, they're so close to zero that we round it down to zero, right? So I wouldn't call that rounding up and rounding down process that we make to get through life, because you have to. If you wait until everything's 100 or zero, you'll never move, right? You've got to make the best optimal choices to get through life. I wouldn't call that a belief. I would just call that a hypothesis. There are some hypotheses that are warranted, or we could say justified, to round off to say, yes, we're going to go with this. Even when you do that, though, an honest scientist would admit, I might be wrong here. Of course, believers in faith and religion, they never admit that little probability that they might be wrong. They might think that the resurrection of Jesus, for example, gives enough justification for them to make their belief something that they would call knowledge, that Jesus rose from the dead. Some of us would disagree with that, but even they would have to admit that they don't know 100%. So I would say in all fields of knowledge, which is what we could call science, even history, which I think is a kind of weak science. It's an important science. Science is a way of knowing. History is probably the weakest that we have. And historians will always, if you read history books, you hear the words likely, or the consensus is, or most probably not, or it's very doubtful. You hear phrases like that, which are really just sort of putting your point into some place between 0 and 100, or between 0.0 and 1.0. You're putting your probability in there. If it's over 5 or 50%, we would say yes. If it's lower than 5, we would say no. That's kind of how we do. Or we would say probably yes, or probably no, or likely yes, or likely no. So I think that's what knowledge is. I wouldn't call it justified belief necessarily, because I think belief is when it's unjustified. I think belief is when you don't have knowledge, you're going with it anyway. And I think for people like Justin Brearley and other apologists and religious scholars, using the phrase justified belief as a way to smuggle in belief. Hey, we're all believers. Even you atheists are believers, right? You're all believers. You're not sure about anything. So I'm uncomfortable with that terminology of defining knowledge as justified belief. It is justified. It's a justified rounding up of a hypothesis, let's say, that we're going to go with. That's how I would define it.
Yeah, I actually thought about it at length after the conversation, and I actually thought that this was not negated by the gentleman, because I think what he was doing, he was the justification he's using is at agency level, at the person's level, while the person might be determined, but the actual tendencies that have been deterministic to start with are still justified. So you can shift justification from the lower level at the person to the actual bigger picture, and you still all your justifications intact, because all these observable facts are leading to these logical consequences, and therefore they're still all justified. Might not be justified at the individual level, negating their free will, but if you put them all together, they will end up giving you Dan Barker or Hanney Seylim or these people, because all these consequences and all these beautiful mix of incidents and genes and will yield always that sort of result. So they are justified in a way, but not at that person's level. You need to sort of probably zoom out a little bit and go at the maybe the macro level, not the micro level.
Well, that's why we have trial by jury. You don't really know. You don't really know all the facts. And so both sides go in and argue for or against, and then the jury, supposedly jury of the peers, I don't think that elephant had a jury of its peers, did it? Right? But anyway, the jury of the peers is going to make some kind of a determination beyond a reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe justified hypotheses or justified belief is where you get beyond a reasonable doubt, and then you go with it. In fact, I'm going back on his show in a few days, Justin Berry's show.
All right.
And we're going to talk about another of my books with him. I wrote that book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction.
Yes.
There's a whole bunch of books now that are going after me. Here's this one, Pop Atheists. And there I am next to Neil deGrasse Tyson and Sam Harris and that. Right. And they're going after we atheists really don't understand logic or the Bible. There's one called Answering the Music Man. That's all about me. A whole bunch of scholars at Southern Evangelical Seminary. They went to one of my debates, and so this is their rebuttal to a debate that I did at one of the things. But next week I'm going to go on and talk about a guy who wrote a book countering God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, and his book is called God is Good. So all of those 28 nasty adjectives of God that Richard Dawkins and I are defending, he says they all have an answer, right? So and Justin is a very likable guy. He's very smart. He's very cordial, very civil, and I like that kind of dialogue. I think we need more dialogue like that, and we need to look at all sides, not just our own. In fact, I think a lot of atheists are guilty of it. I've heard from atheists who have watched my debates, and they said, "Oh, I loved your debate, but I just fast forwarded through the other guy."
Oh, that's horrible. Yeah.
So they just want to get the goodies, right? They just want to hear, but they don't want to give any time to actually listen and analyze and care about what the other side is saying, because those people care. They really care about their views, and they're trying to express them to us. And so at minimum, don't we owe them the courtesy of listening and trying to understand what they're saying? So then when we do reply, we're not attacking a straw man, we're attacking a strong man. We're actually replying to their very arguments.
Yeah. Do you think the question of whether we have free will or not is a scientific or philosophical question, or both?
Yeah, it's both, obviously. The big analogy I use in the central part of my book about free will, I call it harmonic free will. And so you can hear a note of music. Are you a musician at all? You play guitar or sing or anything?
No, I'm not. I'm sorry, okay. But I know you're a wonderful one.
Okay, but you like music, I'm sure.
I love music for sure.
And you probably have emotional responses to some music, right? So as a human being, there's this musical part of our species that's very important. And it's so important that it shows up in churches and synagogues. I mean, it's a part of life. But I'm a jazz composer and a jazz improviser. And so I view music at one hand like the classical musicians do. Classical musicians, I think, are this horizontal, right? They're following the rules, they're sticking with it, they're playing right, they have technique, and they're really, and within that, they find some emotion to express. Some beautiful classical music, which makes you cry, right? But jazz musicians, I think, are not like this. Jazz musicians are like this. There's that analogy again, changing the axis, where you can hear a single note of music. That note of music makes sense two different ways at the same time. It makes sense in the horizontal way, which we call melody. Here's a note, another note, another note, another note, another note, another. It's like on the axis of time, there's this melody that's going, right? And this particular note could relate to the next note or notes in the melody in a linear sense, kind of like cause and effect through time, kind of like how we look at free will, right? We are individual animals. We're living our lives, melodic lives, like the chipmunk in the backyard. But jazz musicians flip it. and composers, jazz composers, people who improvise, and the same note that might seem like it's up or higher than this note, harmonically, that same note might actually be down and in the harmonic structure. So I can ask, does this note have a resolution that goes up, or does this note have a resolution that goes down? You can say melodically, yeah, it wants to go down. That's how you can find it. But if you look at it harmonically, no, the note wants to go up. So which is it? Is it up or down? It's both. It depends on your frame of reference. So is free will, do we have free will or don't we? Yes or no? Is it up or down? You can answer both by saying, well, scientifically, no. Scientifically, cause and effect, no. We are all determined. Determinism rules the day. There is no such thing as free will. But this way, socially or harmonically, we can say, wait a minute, yeah, we're not looking at this question. We're not even asking that question. We're asking this question. Harmonically, yes, we do have free will. It's like the note does want to go up instead of down. So I think you're asking a good question. And should it bother us that you can answer the same question two different ways, depending on the context? Some people, it bothers them. They're like dogmatic. It has to be one answer or another. But others of us realize that, instead of thinking like classical musicians, which have their beauty in the world, thinking more like an improviser, like we live our daily lives, most of us. We improvise as we go through our daily lives. But as you're talking to me right now, it's not because you memorized some script that you practiced like a classical musician over many years. You didn't memorize it this whole show. You're just kind of on the fly, right? Your brain is just making this up. So that's where we live our lives, in that more horizontal, social, improvised way, where we can say, as a social truth, that we do in fact have free will.
Yeah. So I guess because that's an accusation from our fellow theists. They're saying how boring life is it going to be if everything's deterministic? You make no choices, really. Everything is made up for you. But you've countered that, and I agree with you that because we don't know what we are about to be deciding, or life is unfolding in front of us, like as if we are the perpetrators of our life's actions, but also the witness of our life. Like we watch ourselves do things, and sometimes to our dismay. But maybe that's the excitement, because we don't really know what we're doing. And you've defined that as well by a problem with the character of the alleged God, that if God knows the future, then he's got no power to change it, and how boring it is to know the future. So you want to elaborate on that bit?
Yeah, so I've said this in other books before. I call it FANG, F-A-N-G, the free will argument for the non-existence of God. And depends how you define God. There's a bunch of different definitions of God, but if you define God like most traditional Christians do, as a personal being who makes decisions, who has all power, and who has all knowledge, who's omniscient, that means that this being, if it exists, knows everything about the past, the present, and the future, including its own future actions. So suppose this God exists. This God knows that tomorrow at 12 noon, it's going to choose chocolate, not vanilla. This God knows this because he's all-knowing and he's all-powerful. And so if you're all-knowing about your future actions, that puts limits on your future power, doesn't it? You can't change what you know you're going to do. So in a sense, those Christians are right. It's very boring. God has a very boring life because it's all mapped out in advance. So something's got to give, either the all power or the personalness of it, or the all knowingness of it. Something's got to give there if you want to grant to this God freedom to make decisions, to change his mind. And by freedom and free will, we mean that you have to have, in order to have free will, if you have it or not, there has to be a period of time between now and your final decision during which you could change your mind, right? Like when you go to the store, you could choose vanilla. You haven't got there yet. I might choose chocolate. There's this period of time when you don't actually know, like you're saying. the future is not fixed. It's open. If we knew the future, we could not have free will, because then there would not be that period of time during which you could make a decision to change your mind. You've already made it before, right?
Yeah.
So if there's a God, then he's either he's not all-knowing, or he's not all-powerful, or he's not a person. He's more like a robot, I guess. He has this nature that he has to fulfill, and that's who he is, and that's what he does, and he knows what he's going to do.
Yeah.
But you're probably going to say that there are some theologians and apologists who suggest that my criticism is invalid because God lives outside of time. You hear that a lot.
William Lane Craig would be a proponent to that.
So, ha, atheist, that's a bad argument, because you can't judge God as a temporal being, even though God does know that what he's going to do tomorrow. God also knows that he could have changed his mind, but he knows that he didn't. So he has free will. He was free to make his decision. But then that just raises the whole coherency of the concept of a being that can exist outside of time. What the heck does that mean? You can only act in time. You can only make a decision in time. You can't, if you suppose you have some vantage point outside of space-time where you know and see everything that was done, including your own, well, then you're not really a being. You're not a creature. You're not you're just a concept. You're
an abstract number, like number 7.
Well, yeah, okay, whatever. So, but my criticism, I admit, the Fang argument, only applies to a certain kind of God. There are some theologians who say, well, yeah, there's something does have to give. So God has what we call limited omniscience. Some of them will say that. God can't know everything, and that's not an indictment of God, because gods are not, what is a God? So you can tinker with definitions, and some people then they tinker with omnipotence. They tinker with the power. God can only do what is reasonable to be done, in other words. Yeah. So you can cobble together some definition of a God where maybe all that stuff holds together, but that's not the God of the Bible or the Quran.
Yeah, like completely in agreement here. But one other thing that is emerging, and quite rapidly as well, and it will get scarier as time goes by, and I think it follows from the entropy, the physical entropy that we're going through, where things are going from simple to complex to chaotic. And it seems that going to the ice cream parlor and choose between vanilla and chocolate is overly simplified, because looks like, or it is happening right now, when you go to an ice cream place, there are probably more than 50 different choices to choose from. And so is morality. Morality is no longer about just doing what's right or avoiding what's wrong. There are the 50 shades of gray in between, where you can choose the lesser evil or the better good, or all these complex choices are going to sort of throw us into even more sort of a dilemma of what we really should be choosing, and what we choose as a society or individuals. Do you think with the complexity in the future of multiple choices, more than one or two that we had in the past, is this going to put our illusion of free will at a proper test?
So there's a chapter in the free will book where I kind of talk about this. Some people think true freedom comes, and I'm not one of those, but some people actually think, like kind of a new age Zen kind of thing, that true freedom comes from not having to make any choices at all. That's making a choice is a trap, they say, and having more choices is more of it. So wouldn't life be better if it was just simple, that, like my backyard chipmunk? Who's to say that chipmunk is not leading a fulfilling life? Who are we to say that? I mean, it fits its environment, it fits its evolution, it's in its habitat, and it's living and it's reproducing. So, what if a chipmunk were forced with all the choices that we humans have to make? I don't know how much I buy into that idea, because I think choice is part of humanity. I think choice is beautiful. But the point I try to make in that chapter is that I think the illusion of free will is stronger when the choices are more. When the choices are fewer, or when there's no choice at all, what's the free will, right? So you're on a desert island and there's another person on the island with you, depending on your sexual orientation, another male or another female. And then after a while, you look at that person and you say, I choose you. Well, thanks, right? That's your only choice. So when the choices are bigger, the illusion of free will gets bigger. When our decisions are simple, when the judgments that we make are kind of simple judgments, then we don't think so much about free will, do we? We just think, I like chocolate, so I'm buying chocolate, right?
Yes.
Why do you like chocolate? I don't want to analyze why I like chocolate. Maybe it goes all the way back to the Big Bang. Who knows? I don't care. Right now, I like chocolate, and so I'm going to pick chocolate. So I think there is something to be said, though, in this whole idea of a simpler, better life has fewer choices in it. And some people do. They like to simplify their lives down so where there's basic, and people like Thoreau and others will talk about, the simple
Yeah.
life is the better life.
It's
Yeah.
funny. It's funny, like when you were the story about you and yourself and your wife and how you fall in love after the famous show. And sometimes you think you liked a person, you fell in love with them, and at that point when you're making the choice to be with them or to wanting to have a relationship with them, you're not comparing them to all the different choices. You're not thinking, oh, she's pretty, but I'm just going to put her into comparison now with everybody that I've ever met or everybody who could I ever meet in the future, just to make sort of a choice. You sort of live your life, and this is the moment that you're not comparing. You don't think you're making any choices. It's just happening. It's happening to you, and you're witnessing it as it unfolds. So maybe that's what sort of protects us from the dilemma of every day having to choose, and please choose quickly between A, B, and C before the store closes, sort of thing. So maybe that could be it.
Well, also, when you're choosing a mate, there's all sorts of other evolutionary instinctive things going on beneath the surface, chemical things and all sorts of things that are affecting our judgment. When people are crazy when they're in love, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that enhances and moves, because the survival of the species depends on us reproducing. And in a big sense, even though you're choosing your mate, you didn't choose your sexual orientation. You didn't pick that. I mean, that's something that happens. In fact, I had a roommate in college who was gay, and we were sitting in the car one day, and we both knew we both knew he was gay and I was straight. I hate that word straight, but anyway, because maybe he's straight and we're not, I mean,
depends how you look at it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but so as a college student, a girl, a co-ed young woman walks by, and my head just kind of naturally turns. You know what I mean? That's what you do, right? And, oh, okay, look. And then a guy walked by the other side on the street, and his head just naturally turned. And we both noticed it. We said, "Look at that." And I said, "Well, didn't you see that?" And he said, "Well, didn't you see that?" I mean, that in my head would not have turned with a guy walking by, right? And all I saw was like a cardboard person walking by the street. But in his mind, that was pretty special, right? And all he saw was a cardboard female walking down the street. And in my mind, it wasn't just some car. I mean, this was, you know, subconsciously, I guess it's a matter of survival and reproduction and all of that goes into it. We can't help ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So, do we have free will? Did I have free will for my head to turn like that? Well, yes and no. It depends what frame of reference you're using.
Yeah. Dan, I've got a very quick question from one of our spectators at the moment. Is asking you about what did you think of Sam Harris's book or notion of free will? And I know you agree with most of what Sam Harris is saying, apart from the very final conclusion. So maybe we can elaborate on that.
So I think it's a wonderful book. I think Sam Harris put a lot of thought into it. And we do agree that free will is an illusion. The only disagreement we have that I don't think amounts to anything, but the only disagreement we have is that I think the concept of free will is is useful and it's beautiful, that we should embrace it, like other illusions in life, like depth perception or whatever. He thinks the illusion of free will is dangerous and pernicious and we should reject it. We both agree it's an illusion. And so there's no argument there about determinism. He's absolutely right, and the scientists are absolutely right. So another tiny disagreement I would have with him and with some other scientists is their reliance on these experiments, like the Benjamin Libet, or however you say his name, experiment, that proves, by the way, that our actions are made before we are consciously aware of them. And they've done these experiments. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
In fact, the experimenters, the scientists, can tell you your decision before you even know what it is, because they're reading the brain, right? I think that's incredible. But the tiny disagreement I would have with that is that I don't think free will requires consciousness. Whereas a lot of people think in order to have free will, you have to be conscious of the choice you're making. So that's another slight disagreement there. Although in Michael Shermer, who wrote the foreword to my book, he references these studies showing, look at that, how amazing that is. And it's kind of spooky when you think about it. That a scientist who doesn't even know you can tell you what your decision is going to be a half second, or in some cases with these later experiments, maybe 5 to 10 seconds before you actually make the decision.
Mm-hmm.
Without realizing it, you're trapped. That decision you made to choose chocolate might not have been a split second. It might have been a half or 1 or 2 seconds before that. Well, that's pretty amazing. That does show that there's, in our brains, there's a time lapse. And even right now, as we're talking to each other, we're not experiencing this conversation in real time.
Yeah.
There's a slight lag in our brains to process the information and the visual, to put it all together. So to us, all of our experience is history.
Yes.
Slightly delayed from real time, or maybe more delayed from real time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even when you look at things, I mean, just looking at your own wife, you think it's happening real time, but the fact of the matter is, it's the photon that is falling on that person, and by the time you look at them, you always look into history. We're always looking into history. There's latency always ingrained in everything we do and we witness, and maybe that's a good thing, because Dennett is saying this is the whole of you, your subconscious and your consciousness, and that's all of you. That's some of your subconscious is made of deterministic tendencies because of your genes, and some others because of some experiences you go through in life, and they might end up being pushed into your subconscious, and that becomes who you are. All of that is who you are, and therefore, when we put people responsible to certain actions, it's because we think that's the whole person, whether they do it subconsciously or unconsciously. That is who you are. You are that groupage of all these tendencies, and that will give rise to psychology. How can you overcome your subconscious? How can you bring some suppressed memories or suppressed traumas back into the fore so you can deal with them? That's who you are. That's most of us is almost like we're that iceberg that most of us are submerged and we can't see, and we have got to unlock that.
Yeah, but the part you can't see is not you. It's you. You know, even though you can't consciously see it, it is you. So it doesn't mean there's some weird robot down there doing something. Your mind is doing all these things at once. You're thinking maybe 3 or 4 things, and there's a sub routines that are going. You're also doing a lot of other stuff that you're not aware of. Not to mention the automatic controlling of your heartbeat and that, but you're filtering out noises that you don't want to hear. You're doing all these hundreds and things, and then you're thinking about that and this narrative. And I like the way that Dan Dennett, as you mentioned, how he sums it up in his book, Consciousness Explained. He summarizes consciousness as the center of narrative gravity. So it's not a thing. You can't say, oh, there's the consciousness right there, like it's a thing you can look at. There's all these different voices in your mind, if we can use that phrase, or modules, some people would say. They're all functioning, and maybe they evolved independently somewhat, or maybe they co-evolved together. Maybe they evolved at the same time. Whatever they are, there's all these things happening at once in your brain right now. And just like the center of gravity of any gravitational system. Where's the center of gravity of a donut? It's not in the donut, right? It's not a thing. It's just a concept. The center of gravity between the Earth and the moon. You know where that is? That's down beneath the surface of the Earth somewhere. That's why we have these, lunar tides that are causing these frictions. So a center of gravity is a concept, and he says, Dan Dennett says, that consciousness is just like that. It's not a thing. It's when you take the whole system, all of these different modules, and you have the center of narrative gravity, which is what we kind of are thinking about as our consciousness that sort of has our focus in this direction right here, even though there's all this other stuff going on at the same time.
Right. Then I'd like to finish up with the last notion, because that's probably going to be the sort of the yielding question. If it is true, and I think it's still, I'm with you, there's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more that we're going to learn and discover as neuroscience sort of advance and other sciences advance, and we will get to know more about our brain. It's a very, very sort of new sort of science. It's only been probably 100 years old of that, and we will undoubtedly know a lot more about it in the future. But do you think, if it is true that as we keep discovering the deterministic sort of nature of everything that is around us, and if it's true that free will is one of those as well, could that be another nail in the coffin of at least the Abrahamic God?
Well, yeah, there's already enough nails in the coffin, but we could add some more. The Abrahamic God, Islam and Christianity and Judaism. So it all depends on your definition of this God. And even the followers of the Abrahamic God, let's just look at Christians, for example. You don't have to be an expert to see that all these experts disagree with each other. There's no one Christianity. There's no one way of defining this God. They all think they have the right way. And when I was a preacher, I thought I had the right way, and all these other poor theologians and Christians, they got it wrong. What's wrong with them? They don't see the truth of the Bible the way it should be seen, like I do. Well, they all say that, right? So if there is a God, then he's pretty inept, because he can't make himself known in a way that we would all see it. If there truly is one God, there should only be one religion. And yet, why is the whole world split up into thousands and thousands of religions? Even in Islam, you have your different sects. And did you come from an Islamic culture in Egypt?
Yeah, I'm an ex-Muslim. Yeah.
Okay, so even you would know that even within Islam, there's no uniformity. There's all these different,
many things. Yeah, for sure.
All these different ways of looking at. And why Abraham? We all know Abraham is the common ancestor of the three religions. But here's this guy who was willing and able to kill his own son, right? Because God told him to. And because he was willing, he was deemed to be a true obedient follower of God, of Yahweh, right? Well, like Julia Sweeney says in her play, Letting Go of God, if God asked me to kill my child, shouldn't the proper response be, no, I will not kill my child? That's not a good thing to do. And yet somehow Abraham was honored because he had the willingness to kill not only another human, but his own child to prove his devotion to this God. Some of us think, and I think you agree with me, that if God asked us to do that, we would say, go to hell, God. I'm not doing that. That's immoral. That's wrong. I'm using my moral judgment. And if that sends me to hell, then go ahead and prove what a big macho man you are. Send me to hell then. I would rather go to hell doing the right thing, moral thing, than submitting to a dictator who's bloodthirsty, who demands obedience by asking us to sacrifice what it means to be moral, by asking us to totally jettison what it means to be a good, caring, loving human being. So, so there's another couple of nails we can add into that coffin.
Even when they use that story, Dan, in the Islamic story, the kid is not Isaac; it's Ishmael.
Ishmael,
yeah. But some apologists would say, well, he knew that he was not going to do all of that. It's a way of God abolishing human sacrifice and teaching Abraham a lesson, but they neglect a lot of things, the psychological traumas these two alleged children would have gone through. The dad would have endured a certain trauma as well, having to kill his son to please that weird God, and again puts the morality notion in question. Is it arbitrary? Is it because God demands it to be? It's the divine command theory. Is it good because God says so, or God says so because it's good? And if it's good, regardless of God, then it's almost like the rules of logic. If God has to abide to the rules of morality and the rules of logic, then he is bound by exactly the same things we're bound by, and therefore he's no longer that transcendent. He is working within the laws of logic, just like us, and has got a morality that he's bound by too. So why is he superior to us then?
I think it's possible that Abraham, if he existed, let's just say this character in the story, it's possible that he did not struggle with anything, because there are some religious believers who are just plain nuts. They're going to do whatever God tells them to. They're not rooted in human values. They're rooted in some spooky supernatural idea of obedience to the master. That's dangerous. That's just crazy. And there are some people like that in this world, and you know who they are. They're not thinking about the real world. They're thinking about their big daddy, their big, dictator, master. They're thinking about pleasing and glorifying that person at the expense of true human morality.
Yeah. Dan, I'd like to thank you so much for the conversation. Do you have any final words you want to sort of finish up in terms of free will?
Oh, free will. Okay. Well, I guess I would say that I would summarize by saying that let's admit that it's an illusion, but let's embrace the illusion, because I think without the illusion of free will, just like without the illusion of depth perception, you can't truly navigate the moral terrain. You have to have some way of assessing accountability and responsibility, and even things like mercy and justice and forgiveness. All of these concepts assume that we live in a world, in a society of free will. So let's embrace it. Let's agree with the scientists. No, it's not a thing that exists. We don't have it. We're all deterministic animals. But let's go ahead and champion it, just like we champion all sorts of other things that are not scientific truths, but which we find beautiful in our lives.
Once again, Dan, I'd like to thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. You have been with Hanney Seylim and Dan Barker, talking about his wonderful book, and I'll put it one more time for people that like to seek it, Free Will Explained by Dan Barker. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll talk to you later.